There are spaces in our cities that should not exist, not because they're dangerous, not because they're forbidden, but because geometrically, architecturally, physically, they simply should not fit, and yet they do. This is the story of someone who found one of those spaces, not in a haunted mansion, not in an abandoned facility, but in a completely ordinary apartment building in a completely ordinary city. It began with a simple observation, a mistake perhaps, a counting error. Except it was not a mistake, and what lay behind that error would force one person to reconsider what it means to be observed, and by whom. This is the story of the floor above the ceiling. Chapter 1. The count that never matches. I moved into the building in late September. It was one of those older structures you find scattered throughout the city. Red brick facade, narrow hallways, radiators that clanked at night. Built sometime in the early 1960s, maybe earlier. The kind of place that had survived decades of rezoning, renovations, and ownership changes without losing its original bones. My apartment was on the 7th floor. The lease said 7th floor. The elevator button I pressed every day said 7. The number beside my door said 703. Everything was straightforward. Until one evening, standing on the sidewalk across the street with a bag of groceries in one hand, I looked up at the building and counted the floors. 8. I counted again. Still 8. I stood there on the sidewalk, shifting the grocery bag to my other hand, squinting up at the building in the fading light of early autumn. The sun was setting behind the structure, casting long shadows across the brick facade. I counted the rows of windows from bottom to top, marking each floor carefully in my mind. Ground floor, 2nd floor, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. 8 distinct levels, 8 rows of windows, 8 floors. But I lived on the 7th floor, the top floor. My lease said so. The building directory in the lobby said so. Everyone I had spoken to said so. I crossed the street and walked half a block down, then turned and looked again, from a different angle. Maybe the perspective had been wrong. Maybe the roofline had created an optical illusion. But no, from this angle it was even clearer. 8 floors, undeniably 8. I went inside. The lobby was empty, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of someone's television playing through the walls. I walked to the elevator and pressed the up button. The panel beside the elevator showed 7 buttons. Basement, ground, floors 2 through 7. 7 floors. I took the elevator to my floor, stepped out into the familiar hallway, walked to the stairwell at the end of the corridor and pushed through the heavy metal door. The stairwell was painted an industrial grey-green, the kind of colour that exists only in older buildings. The steps were concrete. The railing was cold metal. I started at the top and began descending, counting each flight carefully. 7 to 6, 1 flight, 6 to 5, 2 flights, 5 to 4, 3 flights, 4 to 3, 4 flights, 3 to 2, 5 flights, 2 to ground, 6 flights, ground to basement, 7 flights, 7 floors total. I stood in the stairwell between the ground floor and the basement, my hand resting on the railing, trying to reconcile the numbers. 8 floors from the outside, 7 floors from the inside. I climbed back up to the 7th floor, pushed through the stairwell door, and walked to the window at the end of the hallway. It faced the street. I looked down at the sidewalk where I had been standing minutes earlier, then looked up, trying to see if there was something above me. A rooftop structure maybe, a mechanical room, but there was nothing visible from this angle, just the ceiling of the hallway, ordinary white acoustic tiles marked with the occasional water stain. I went back to my apartment and tried to let it go, but I could not. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the missing floor, or the extra floor, depending on how you counted. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings are strange. Architectural plans change during construction. Basements sometimes count as floors from the outside, but not from the inside. Mezzanines exist. Utility levels exist. There were a dozen rational explanations, but none of them felt right. I got up and went to my window, looked across the street at the building opposite mine, counted its floors, then counted the windows on my own building, visible in the reflection of the glass across the street. 8 floors. I did it again the next day. From the street, 8 floors. From the stairwell, 7. I asked my neighbour across the hall, a man in his 50s who had lived there for over a decade. His name was Marcus. He worked from home and always seemed to be shuffling between his apartment and the trash chute wearing the same flannel bathrobe. "How many floors does this building have?" I asked him one afternoon, when we both happened to be checking our mail in the lobby. He glanced up from the stack of envelopes in his hand. 7, why? "Just curious. Someone told me it was 8. "Nope, 7. Been here 12 years. Always been 7. "You ever been on the roof?" "No. Building manager keeps it locked." "Why are you asking?" "No reason. Just trying to get a sense of the place." He shrugged and went back to sorting his mail. I counted again that night. Same result. 8 from the outside, 7 from the inside. The difference sat in my mind like a splinter I could not remove. I started taking different routes to and from the building, walking around the block, looking at it from every angle. The count never changed. From every external perspective, the building had 8 floors, but from every internal perspective, it had 7. I began sketching the building's layout in a notebook, measuring the height of each floor by counting bricks on the facade, calculating the ceiling heights, trying to find where the extra space could be hidden. The math did not add up. If the building was 8 stories tall externally, and each floor had a ceiling height of approximately 10 feet, which was standard for buildings of that era, then the total height should be around 80 feet, plus the roof. I estimated the building's height from the street. It was definitely around 80 to 85 feet. But if there were only 7 accessible floors internally, each with 10-foot ceilings, that left at least 10 to 15 feet of space unaccounted for. A missing floor. Or something occupying the space where a floor should be. I started paying attention to the other residents, watching how they moved through the building, listening to how they talked about it. No one ever mentioned an 8th floor. No one ever seemed to notice the discrepancy. It was as if I were the only person who had ever counted. Chapter 2. The elevator delay. It started happening about 2 weeks after I moved in. I would press the button for the 7th floor. The elevator would begin its ascent, the motor humming in its familiar rhythm, the cables creaking slightly as the car rose through the shaft. And then, somewhere between the 6th and 7th floors, it would pause, not stop. Pause. The lights would flicker once, just once, and the elevator would hang there in the shaft for maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. No alarm, no mechanical grinding, just silence and that faint electrical hum that all elevators make. Then it would continue upward and open at my floor as if nothing had happened. At first I thought it was a mechanical issue. Old buildings have old elevators. Things lag, cables slip, motors hesitate. I had lived in enough aging apartments to know that minor malfunctions were part of the experience, but it kept happening. Not every time, but often enough to establish a pattern. Always in the same place, always between 6 and 7, and always with that single flicker of the lights. I started paying closer attention, watching the floor indicator as the elevator climbed. The numbers would illuminate in sequence, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the light would flicker, and there would be that pause. and then 7 would light up and the doors would open. But during the pause, no number was illuminated. The indicator was dark, as if for those few seconds the elevator existed in a space that had no designation. One night, I stood in the elevator with my hand pressed flat against the wall during the pause. The wall was vibrating, not violently, just a low, steady hum, like the building itself was breathing, like something large and mechanical was operating just beyond the thin metal panel. The vibration felt intentional, controlled, not the random shudder of old machinery. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, I stepped out quickly, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I started experimenting, taking the elevator at different times of day, riding it up and down repeatedly, trying to find a pattern. The pause happened most frequently late at night, between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning. During the day, it was less common, but it still happened. I tried pressing different floor buttons to see if the pause occurred in other parts of the shaft. It did not. The elevator moved smoothly between all other floors. Only between 6 and 7 did it hesitate. I tried riding the elevator with other residents to see if they noticed. They did not. Or if they did not react. They stood there scrolling on their phones or staring at the floor indicator, completely unbothered by the pause. One evening, I rode the elevator with an older woman from the 5th floor. I had seen her before, but never spoken to her. She was carrying a small dog in a canvas tote bag. The elevator began to rise. We passed the 3rd floor, the 4th, the 5th. She got off without a word. I continued alone. The elevator climbed to 6. Then came the pause. I watched the floor indicator. The light flickered. The number went dark. And in that moment, I heard something. A sound from beyond the elevator shaft. Faint but distinct. Footsteps, not below me, not above me, beside me, as if someone were walking in a hallway that ran parallel to the elevator shaft. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Then the elevator resumed its climb. The number 7 lit up, and the doors opened onto my floor. I stood there staring at the empty hallway, my pulse racing. I mentioned it to the building manager the next week during a chance encounter in the lobby. His name was Leonard. He was a man in his 60s with the perpetually tired expression of someone who had been dealing with tenant complaints for far too long. "Elevator's been acting weird," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Pauses between floors sometimes." He nodded without looking up from his clipboard. "Yeah, we know. It is old. We are working on it." "Has anyone else complained?" "Not recently." "Do you know what is causing it?" He sighed and finally looked at me. "It is an old building. Old elevator. These things happen. We have a technician scheduled to look at it next month." "Next month?" "Unless it is an emergency, that is the best I can do." I wanted to push further, to ask if he had ever heard footsteps between floors, to ask if he knew about the missing floor. But something in his expression told me the conversation was over. He walked away before I could say anything else. That night, I took the elevator down to the basement. I wanted to see the bottom of the shaft, to see if there was any visible evidence of the extra space. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of old concrete and heating oil. There were storage units lining one wall and a mechanical room behind a locked metal door. I walked to where I estimated the elevator shaft would be. The wall was smooth brick, no doors, no access panels, no indication that anything unusual existed beyond it. I pressed my ear against the wall. Silence. I stood there for several minutes listening, and then faintly I heard it. That same low hum. The same vibration coming from somewhere inside the wall. Chapter 3. The Maintenance Map. I am not someone who goes looking for locked rooms, but I am someone who notices when a door that is usually closed is suddenly ajar. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just come back from a run and was heading toward the stairwell to stretch when I saw it. The utility room door on the ground floor, propped open with a rubber doorstop. Inside, I could see shelves stacked with cleaning supplies, a mop bucket, a metal ladder leaning against the wall. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete floors and exposed pipes running along the ceiling. And on the far wall, illuminated by a single bare bulb, was a laminated map of the building. I glanced down the hallway. Empty. I could hear someone moving around on the floor above, footsteps muffled by carpet and distance, but no one was nearby. I stepped inside. The map was large, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, printed on thick laminated paper and mounted to a corkboard. It showed the building in cross-section, with each floor drawn in clean blue lines. The plumbing was marked in blue, the electrical in red, the structural elements in black. Each floor was labelled clearly: basement, ground floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor, fifth floor, sixth floor. And then, in a space that should not have existed, tucked between the sixth and seventh floors, there was another label. It was printed smaller than the others, in a different font, as if it had been added later. The line indicating the floor was thinner, almost tentative. The label read, "Observation level, restricted access." No apartment numbers, no utility notations, no indication of what the space was used for. Just those 4 words. Observation level, restricted access. I leaned closer, studying the map. The space occupied by the observation level was narrow, perhaps only 8 feet of vertical clearance, but it spanned the entire footprint of the building. The diagram showed no stairs leading to it, no elevator access, no doorways. But there were markings, small symbols I did not recognise, geometric shapes, circles, triangles, squares, positioned at regular intervals throughout the level. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the map. Just as I pressed the shutter button, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. I slipped my phone into my pocket and quickly stepped out of the room, trying to look casual. A maintenance worker walked past, a man in his 30s wearing coveralls and carrying a toolbox. He glanced at me, but did not stop, just nodded and continued toward the basement stairwell. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and rode up to my floor. That night, I studied the photo on my phone, zooming in on the observation level, trying to decipher the symbols. They were arranged in a grid pattern. Each symbol corresponded to a specific location on the floor plan, and beneath each symbol was a small alphanumeric code. I tried searching online for similar symbols, building codes, architectural notation, engineering diagrams. I found nothing that matched. The next morning, I went back to the utility room. The door was locked. I tried the handle twice just to be sure. Locked. I knocked. No answer. I went to the building manager's office on the ground floor. Leonard was sitting behind a desk covered in paperwork, drinking coffee from a chipped mug. "I have a question about the building layout," I said. He looked up. "What about it?" "I saw a map in the utility room yesterday. It showed something called an observation level." "What is that?" His expression did not change, but there was a brief pause before he answered, just long enough to be noticeable. "We do not have an observation level," he said flatly. "The map showed it, between the 6th and 7th floors." "That is old. The map is outdated. We had some plans years ago that never went through. Someone probably forgot to update the print." "What were the plans for?" "I do not know, before my time." "Can I see a current map?" "We do not have one available for tenants." He turned back to his paperwork, making it clear the conversation was over. I left the office and went back to the utility room. The door was still locked, but now there was a new sign taped to it. "Authorised personnel only." The sign had not been there an hour ago. Chapter 4. Sounds from above. I do not sleep well in new places. It takes me weeks to adjust to the ambient noise of a new building. The pipes clanking at odd hours. The neighbours walking overhead. The way sound travels through walls and ceilings in patterns I have not yet learned to ignore. But this was different. It started about a month after I moved in. I would be lying in bed, almost asleep, when I would hear it. Footsteps, not hurried, not random, slow, deliberate, methodical, the sound of someone walking back and forth across a room. At first I assumed it was the apartment above me. Maybe someone who worked night shifts. Maybe someone with insomnia. Except there was no apartment above me. I was on the 7th floor, the top floor. According to every official document, every directory, every conversation I had had with building management and residents, there was nothing above me except the roof. But the footsteps continued. They always happened at night. Never during the day. Never in the early evening. Only after midnight. And they always followed the same pattern. A slow walk from one side of the ceiling to the other. A pause. Then back again. The same route, the same rhythm. Over and over. The first few times I tried to convince myself it was something else. Pipes expanding. The building settling. Rodents in the walls. But the sound was too distinct, too heavy, too regular. It was the sound of someone walking. I started timing it. The footsteps would begin around 12:30 in the morning. They would continue for approximately 20 minutes. Then they would stop, always at the same time, always after exactly 20 minutes. I tried staying awake to listen more carefully. I would lie in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to begin. And when it did, I would focus on it, trying to determine the weight, the gait, the purpose. The steps were slow, measured, not the quick pace of someone moving through a space, more like someone inspecting something, observing something, walking back and forth, pausing, continuing. One night, I could not take it anymore. I stood on a chair in the middle of my bedroom and pressed my ear directly against the ceiling. The footsteps were clearer that way, heavier, more deliberate, and I could hear something else beneath them. A faint mechanical sound, a low hum, almost like the sound I had heard in the elevator during the pauses. I pressed harder against the ceiling, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I held my breath, ear still pressed to the ceiling. And then, directly above where I was standing, I heard a different sound. A click, like something opening or closing. I stepped down from the chair and backed away from the ceiling, my heart pounding. The footsteps did not resume. The next day I mentioned the sounds to Marcus, my neighbour across the hall. I caught him in the hallway as he was leaving his apartment. "You ever hear anything at night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Like footsteps?" He frowned. "No, why?" "I keep hearing something above me, like someone walking around." "There is nothing above you. You're on the top floor." "I know, but I definitely hear something." He gave me a look that was somewhere between concern and dismissal. Old buildings make noise, pipes, ducts, stuff expands and contracts. You will get used to it. It does not sound like pipes. What else would it be? I did not have an answer. He shrugged. "Give it time. You are still new here. Everything sounds weird at first." But I did not get used to it. The footsteps continued every night. Always the same pattern. Always the same duration. I started recording them on my phone. I would place the phone on my nightstand and let it run while I tried to sleep. In the morning, I would listen to the recordings. The footsteps were there, clear and unmistakable. But there was something else too. Something I had not noticed in real time. Between the footsteps, there were other sounds, faint, almost imperceptible. Voices. Not words I could understand. Not conversations I could follow. Just the low murmur of voices, like someone speaking in a distant room. I played the recordings over and over, trying to isolate the sounds, trying to make sense of them. But the more I listened, the less sense it made, because the voices were not coming from above me. They were coming from all around me. Chapter 5. The neighbour who knows her name was Evelyn. She lived on the 5th floor and had been in the building for over 30 years. I had seen her before, moving slowly through the lobby with a canvas shopping bag, always dressed in layers even in warm weather. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen a great deal and had stopped being surprised by most of it. I met her in the lobby one afternoon while checking my mail. I was sorting through the usual stack of junk mail and bills when she appeared beside me, moving so quietly I had not heard her approach. "You are new," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Yeah, been here a couple months." She nodded slowly, studying me with pale blue eyes that seemed to look past the surface of things. 7th floor? That is right. How did you know? I pay attention. She paused, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. You have noticed it, have you not? My pulse quickened. Noticed what? The floor that is not there. I glanced around the lobby instinctively, checking if anyone else was nearby. We were alone except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. What do you mean? I asked carefully. She gestured for me to follow her to the far corner of the lobby, away from the mailboxes and the elevator. When we were out of the direct line of sight from the entrance, she spoke again. When I first moved in, she said quietly, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. This building had 8 floors, not 7, 8. What happened to it? They closed it. She said this as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Said there were complaints, never said what kind, just closed it off one day. Sealed the elevator access, removed it from the directory, told everyone it had never existed. When was this? 1994, maybe 95, long time ago now. Why would they close an entire floor? She shook her head slowly. No one would say, but people talked. You know how it is. People always talk. What did they say? She paused, her gaze drifting to the elevator doors across the lobby. They said strange things happened up there. People would go up and come back different. Not hurt, not physically, just different. Like they had forgotten something important, or remembered something they should not have. Different how? Hard to explain. You would see them in the hallway, and they would look right through you. Or they would answer questions you had not asked yet. Or they would avoid certain parts of the building without being able to say why. Do you know anyone who went up there? I knew someone once, man named Thomas. He lived on the 6th floor, said he found a way in through the stairwell. A door that was not supposed to be there, went up one night because he was curious. What did he see? She hesitated, her expression darkening slightly. He said it was just hallways, empty rooms, but the rooms were wrong, shaped wrong. The walls were not straight, and he said the walls reflected things. What kind of things? Things that were not there, or things that had not happened yet. He was not clear about it. He only talked about it once, and then he stopped, said he did not want to think about it anymore. What happened to him? He moved out 2 weeks later, middle of the night, left most of his things behind. Never spoke to anyone in the building again. I tried to reach him later, sent a letter to the forwarding address he left. It came back undeliverable. Do you think he was telling the truth? She looked at me directly. I think he saw something he was not supposed to see, and I think whoever closed that floor did not want anyone seeing it again. Who closed it? Building ownership changed hands around that time. New company, corporate, out of state. They sent contractors in for a week, sealed everything up, repainted the stairwell, reprogrammed the elevator. When they were done, it was like the 8th floor had never existed. But you remember it. Of course I remember it. I am old, not senile. I remember when this building had 8 floors. I remember the apartments up there. I remember the people who lived in them. What happened to those people? They were relocated, different floors, different buildings. Some of them just left. No one questioned it. People do not ask questions when large companies tell them to move. Do you know what the floor was used for? She shook her head. Not officially, but I will tell you this. I lived here for 3 years before they closed it, and in all that time, I never saw anyone going up to the 8th floor. Not once. The elevator would stop there sometimes, but no one would get out, and no one would get in. Then what was it for? I do not know. But I know it is still there. They did not tear it down. They just hid it. How do you know? She smiled faintly. Because I can still hear it. Hear what? The sounds. Late at night. Footsteps. Machinery. Voices. Coming from above the 7th floor. I have been hearing them for 30 years. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hear them too. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Then you were paying attention. Most people do not. They hear the sounds and tell themselves it is the pipes, it is the wind, it is the building settling. They do not want to know. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked, and because I am old enough not to care about the consequences of talking about it. She paused, then added, and because I think you're going to find a way up there eventually. People like you always do. What do you mean? People like me? People who notice things, people who cannot let things go, people who count. She turned and walked toward the elevator without another word, leaving me standing alone in the corner of the lobby. I watched her press the call button and wait. When the elevator arrived and the doors opened, she stepped inside and turned to face me. "Be careful," she said, as the doors began to close. "Whatever is up there, it is still watching." The doors slid shut. I stood there for a long time, processing what she had told me. An 8th floor that used to exist, complaints, strange behaviour, a man who went up and never spoke about it again, and the building ownership that closed it all down and pretended it had never been there. I went back to my apartment and pulled up property records online. It took some digging, but I found the information. The building had changed ownership in 1994, sold to a company called Helix Property Management, corporate headquarters listed in Delaware, no website, no public information beyond the basic registration documents. I searched for other properties owned by Helix. There were dozens, apartment buildings scattered across the country, all of them older structures, all of them in major cities. I cross-referenced the addresses with satellite imagery, counting the floors visible from above. Every single building had a discrepancy. One extra floor visible from the outside that did not appear in the internal layout. Every single one. Chapter 6. The open door. It happened on a Thursday night. I had been working late, staying up past midnight, trying to finish a project that had been dragging for weeks. I finally gave up around 11 and decided to call it a night. I locked my apartment door and walked to the elevator, exhausted and ready for sleep. I pressed the button for the 7th floor, force of habit, even though I was already on 7, and leaned against the elevator wall as the doors slid closed. Wait. I had pressed the button for the 7th floor, but I was already on the 7th floor. The elevator should not have moved, but it did. I felt the slight lurch as the car began to rise. I straightened up, suddenly alert. The floor indicator above the doors showed 7, but the elevator was definitely ascending. I pressed the button for 7 again. Nothing happened. I pressed the emergency stop button. Nothing happened. The elevator continued upward. The lights flickered. And then, just as they always did between the 6th and 7th floors, they steadied again. Except this time, the doors opened. I stepped forward instinctively, expecting to see my hallway. Instead, I saw something else entirely. The hallway was different. Not dramatically, but fundamentally, subtly, in ways that my brain registered immediately as wrong. The walls were smooth, too smooth, no texture, no imperfections, no paint roller marks or patches or nail holes. Just perfectly uniform surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The floor was grey, not carpet, not tile, something else, something I could not identify. It had a slight give to it when I stepped out of the elevator, like walking on rubber, but it made no sound. The lighting came from nowhere, and everywhere at once. No fixtures, no bulbs, no visible source, just a soft, even glow that eliminated all shadows. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet, maybe less. It created a sense of compression, of being in a space not designed for human comfort. And lining both sides of the hallway were doors, grey doors, evenly spaced, identical, no numbers, no markings, just smooth surfaces, the same shade of grey as the floor. I stood in the doorway of the elevator, one hand holding the door open, staring down the hallway. There was no sound, no hum from the lights, no distant voices from apartments, no mechanical noise from HVAC systems, no ambient noise at all. Just silence. Complete, absolute silence. I stepped out fully, and the elevator doors closed immediately behind me. I spun around. There was no call button, no panel, no visible mechanism to summon the elevator back. Just a smooth wall, the same grey as everything else. I pressed my hand against where the doors had been. Solid, seamless. I turned back to the hallway. It stretched in both directions, identical in every way. Doors evenly spaced, walls perfectly straight, lighting uniform. I could not tell which direction led to the front of the building and which led to the back. There were no windows, no exit signs, no indicators of any kind. I chose a direction at random and started walking. My footsteps made no sound on the strange grey floor. The air felt wrong, not cold, not warm, just neutral. Temperature controlled to be completely unnoticeable. I reached the first door. It had no handle, no keyhole, no visible means of opening, just a smooth grey surface, slightly recessed into the wall, and in the centre of the door, at eye level, there was a panel. Not a window, not glass, something else. It looked like a mirror or a screen. A perfectly rectangular panel, maybe 12 inches by 18 inches, set flush with the door. I leaned closer to examine it, and then I saw my reflection. Except it was not my reflection. It was me, but from 5 seconds ago, still standing by the elevator, reaching out to touch the wall where the doors had been. I stepped back quickly, my pulse spiking. The reflection did not follow. It continued moving forward, reaching out toward where I'd just been standing. I watched as the reflection me touched the wall, hesitated, then turned and started walking down the hallway. Toward where I was standing now, I moved to the door across the hall. The same thing. Another panel, another reflection, but this one was ahead of me in time. It showed me standing in front of the door, leaning close to the panel, examining it, which I had not done yet. I was about to do it. I stepped back from the door, breathing hard. The reflection showed me stepping back, exactly as I was doing in real time. For a brief moment, we were synchronized. Then the reflection moved forward again, leaning toward the panel before I did. I moved down the hallway faster now, checking each door. Every single one had a panel. Every single panel showed a reflection, some lagging, some leading, all slightly out of sync. I saw myself walking, stopping, turning around, reaching out to touch doors, pressing my hands against walls, versions of me scattered across time, seconds apart, minutes apart, all trapped in the panels, all being observed. I started walking faster, looking for an end to the hallway, looking for stairs, for an exit sign, for anything that would tell me how to leave. But the hallway just continued. Door after door, panel after panel, reflection after reflection. I stopped in front of one door and stared at the panel. This one showed me in my apartment, standing by the window, looking out at the street. But I was not in my apartment, I was here. I pressed my hand against the panel. It was warm, not hot, just warm, like touching skin. I pulled my hand back quickly and kept moving. The hallway curved slightly, not sharply, just a gentle arc to the left. I followed it, and at the end of the curve there was an opening, not a door, just an open doorway leading into a larger space. I hesitated at the threshold, listening. Silence. I stepped inside. Chapter 7. The Rooms That Observe. The room was vast, circular, or maybe octagonal. It was difficult to tell. The walls curved in ways that made precise geometry uncertain. And covering every surface, every wall from floor to ceiling were panels. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands, each one displaying something different. Not screens, not monitors, not anything technological I recognised. Just windows. That is the only way I can describe them. Windows into other places. I stepped further into the room, my eyes trying to process what I was seeing. Some panels showed rooms, living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens. Some showed hallways, stairwells, lobbies. Some showed outdoor spaces, streets, parks, parking lots. And in many of them there were people going about their lives, sitting, walking, eating, sleeping, working, all being watched, all being observed. I moved closer to the nearest panel. It showed an apartment living room. A woman was sitting on a couch, reading a book. She looked up occasionally, glanced at her phone, then went back to reading. The view was from above, as if the camera, or whatever was recording, was positioned in the ceiling, looking straight down. I recognised the style of the couch, the type of lamp, the layout. It looked like the apartments in my building. I moved to the next panel. A man in a kitchen cooking dinner. Same overhead perspective, same style of apartment. The panel next to it showed an empty hallway. My hallway. The 7th floor hallway of my building. And then I saw it. A panel showing my apartment. The view was from directly above. I could see my couch, my desk, my bed in the other room, the book I had left open on the coffee table, the jacket hanging on the back of my chair, everything exactly as I had left it less than an hour ago. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The panel was live, real time. I could see the clock on my wall, the seconds ticking forward. I looked away and scanned the other panels. There were hundreds of views of apartments, different layouts, different furniture, different people. But not all from my building. Some were clearly from other buildings. Different architectural styles. Different cities, maybe. I moved deeper into the room, following the curve of the wall, more panels, more views, a laundromat, people doing laundry, folding clothes, sitting in plastic chairs waiting for cycles to finish, a subway platform, commuters waiting for trains, some on their phones, some reading, some just staring into space, an office, rows of cubicles, people working at computers, a grocery store, people pushing carts down aisles, selecting items from shelves, all from overhead perspectives, all with that same clean, detached clarity. I kept walking. Some panels showed locations I did not recognise, cities I had never been to, buildings I could not identify, and then I saw a panel that made me stop completely. It showed this room, the observation room I was standing in, but the view was from above, from a perspective I could not locate, from somewhere beyond the ceiling, and in the panel I could see myself standing there, looking up at the panels. I spun around, searching the ceiling. It was smooth, featureless, the same grey as the walls, no visible cameras, no lenses, no openings. But somehow I was being watched from above. I looked back at the panel. I raised my hand slowly. In the panel, my reflection raised its hand a full second later. The delay was consistent with what I had seen in the hallway, some reflections lagging, some leading, but this was different. This was not a reflection, this was observation. I lowered my hand and moved to another section of the room, more panels, more locations, and then I started noticing patterns. The panels were organised, not randomly arranged. They were grouped by location, by building. One section showed views from what appeared to be my building. Different apartments, different floors, different angles. Another section showed views from a different building, a different city. The panels were labelled, small alphanumeric codes in the corner of each view. I recognised the format. It matched the codes I had seen on the maintenance map, the map of the observation level. Each code corresponded to a specific location, a specific viewpoint. This was not surveillance. This was not security. This was something else, something systematic, organised, intentional. I moved to the centre of the room. There was a structure there, not a desk, not a console, just a raised platform, maybe 3 feet in diameter, made of the same grey material as everything else. On the platform was an object. I could not tell what it was made of. It looked metallic, but the surface seemed to shift slightly, like oil on water. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a basketball, with geometric patterns etched into its surface. I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, every panel in the room changed. All at once, every view shifted to show the same thing. Me. Hundreds of panels, thousands of views, all showing me from different angles, different perspectives, different moments in time. Me walking down the hallway, me standing in the elevator, me in my apartment, me on the street, me in the lobby, me everywhere. I jerked my hand back from the sphere. The panels shifted back to their original views. Apartments, streets, offices, stores. I backed away from the platform, my breathing rapid and shallow, and then I heard it. A sound behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I turned. The doorway I had entered through was still open, but standing in the threshold was a figure. I could not see it clearly. The lighting in the room was too uniform, and the figure seemed to blend with the walls, as if it were made of the same material. But it was definitely there, and it was definitely watching me. I did not wait to see what it would do. I ran. Chapter 8. The Purpose Revealed. I do not remember the route I took through the hallways. I just ran. My footsteps still made no sound on the grey floor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. Doors flashing past on either side. Panels reflecting versions of me. Running, stumbling, gasping for breath. I turned corners that I did not remember seeing before. The hallway branched, intersected, curved. I kept running, looking for the elevator, looking for stairs, looking for any way out. And then suddenly, I was back in the circular room. I stopped, disoriented. I had been running away from the room, but somehow I had ended up back inside it. The figure was gone. The panels still displayed their hundreds of views, lives being observed, spaces being monitored. I approached the platform in the centre again, more slowly this time. The sphere was still there, its surface shifting slightly in the light. I did not touch it this time. I just looked at it, studied it, and then I understood. This was not a surveillance system. This was not security footage. This was a study, a systematic observation of human behaviour, human movement, human patterns. The building, my building, was not just an apartment complex. It was a research site, and we, the residents, were the subjects. Not subjects being tested, not subjects being manipulated, just subjects being observed, watched, recorded, catalogued, not for security, not for control, for understanding. Someone or something was studying us, learning how we moved through spaces, how we interacted with our environments, how we lived our daily lives when we thought no one was watching. The observation level was not hidden because it was dangerous. It was hidden because people would leave if they knew they were being watched. I thought about the maintenance map, the label, observation level, restricted access. I thought about the elevator pauses, the moments of suspension between floors, the doorway opening onto a space that should not exist. I thought about Evelyn's story, the 8th floor that used to be accessible, the people who went up and came back different. They had seen this, they had understood what was happening, and they could not process it, so they left, or they forgot, or they convinced themselves it had never happened. I looked at the panels again, all those people, all those lives, all being observed without their knowledge. How many buildings were like this? How many observation levels existed? How many cities had spaces hidden between floors, watching from above? I thought about Helix property management, the dozens of buildings with the same discrepancy, one extra floor visible from the outside. This was not isolated. This was not unique. This was systematic. And then I had another thought. If this was a study, then there were researchers. Someone was reviewing this data, analysing it, drawing conclusions. The figure I had seen in the doorway, was that a researcher or something else? I looked up at the ceiling again, at the smooth grey surface that somehow observed me without visible cameras, and I realised I was not supposed to be here. The observation level was designed to be hidden, inaccessible. The elevator was programmed never to stop here. The stairwell was sealed, the map was removed, but somehow, tonight, the elevator had brought me here. Why? Was it a malfunction? A mistake in the programming? Or was it intentional? I looked back at the panels showing my apartment, my life, my routines. They had been watching me since I moved in. They knew I had noticed the discrepancy. They knew I had been counting floors. They knew I had been asking questions. And tonight they had let me in. Why? To see if I would understand, to see how I would react, or to see if I would tell anyone. I stood there in the centre of the room, surrounded by hundreds of views of human life, and I realised something else. I was part of the study now, not just a subject being observed from above, but a subject who had discovered the observation itself, and that changed the experiment. Chapter 9. The exit that resets. I do not know how long I stood there. Time felt strange in that room, without windows, without sound, without any reference points beyond the ticking seconds visible in some of the panels. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I walked back toward the doorway where I had entered. The hallway beyond was empty. No figure, no movement. I stepped out and started walking, choosing directions at random, hoping to find the elevator. The hallways all looked identical. Same grey walls, same grey floor, same doors with their unsettling panels showing fragmented reflections of time. I turned a corner and found myself facing a dead end. A smooth wall, no doors, no openings. I backtracked and tried a different direction. Another dead end. I tried again and again. Every path seemed to lead nowhere. The hallways looped back on themselves. Intersections led to identical corridors. The architecture was wrong in ways I could not quite articulate. I was starting to panic when I turned one more corner and saw it. The elevator. The same smooth grey doors. The same absence of call buttons. I approached slowly, unsure if it would open, unsure if I wanted it to open. But as I got closer, the doors slid apart silently. Inside was the familiar elevator car. The same worn metal walls, the same flickering fluorescent light, the same scuffed floor. It looked exactly like the elevator in my building. I stepped inside quickly, before the doors could close without me. There was a panel with buttons, 7 floors, basement to 7. No button for the observation level. I pressed 7. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. I felt the movement, smooth, steady, normal. No pause, no flicker, just a straight descent. The floor indicator above the doors showed the numbers counting down. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, ground, basement. Wait, I had pressed 7. Why was it going down past 7? But then the indicator reversed. Basement, ground, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The doors opened. I stepped out into my hallway. The 7th floor hallway of my building. The familiar carpeted floor. The familiar textured walls. The familiar buzzing fluorescent lights. I walked to my apartment, unlocked the door, stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The book on the coffee table. The jacket on the chair. The clock on the wall. I looked at the clock. 11:15. I had left my apartment at 11. I had been gone 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I sat on the couch, my mind racing, trying to process what had happened. I pulled out my phone. The time confirmed it. 11:15. I checked my photos. The picture I had taken of the maintenance map was still there. The only evidence that any of this had happened. I opened my recording app. The audio files of the footsteps were still there. It had happened. It was real. But somehow, almost no time had passed. I stood up and walked to the window, looked out at the street. Everything was normal. Cars passing. A few people walking. The bodega on the corner still lit up. I looked up at my building's reflection in the glass of the building across the street. 7 floors. I counted again. 7 floors. The 8th floor was gone. Chapter 10. The floor is gone. Again. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps. They never came. For the first time since I had moved in, the ceiling was silent. The next morning I went to the utility room. The door was unlocked. I opened it and looked inside. The maintenance map was back on the wall. But it was different. The observation level was gone. The floor plan showed only 7 floors. Basement to 7. No gap, no additional label, no symbols. It was as if the observation level had never existed. I took another picture, compared it to the first one on my phone. The first photo still showed the observation level. The second one did not. 2 different versions of the same map. Both real, both documenting different realities. I checked the elevator, rode it up and down several times. It stopped at 7 floors. No pause between 6 and 7. No flicker of the lights. No moment of suspension. Just a normal elevator in a normal building. I checked the stairwell, counted the flights from bottom to top. 7 floors. I went outside and counted from the street. 7 floors. The discrepancy was gone. I asked Marcus if he had noticed anything unusual lately. He looked at me with concern. Like what? I do not know. Strange sounds, the elevator acting weird. No, why? Are you okay? Yeah, just tired. He nodded slowly. You should get some rest. You look exhausted. I went back to my apartment. That night, I recorded audio again while I tried to sleep. In the morning, I listened to the file. Silence, no footsteps, no voices, no mechanical hum. Just the ambient noise of an old building. Pipes, wind, distant traffic. I checked the panels in my apartment, the smoke detector, the thermostat, the electrical outlets. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I searched online for Helix Property Management again. The company still existed, still owned dozens of buildings. But when I cross-referenced the addresses with satellite imagery again, the discrepancies were gone. Every building now showed the correct number of floors from every angle. Either I had miscounted before, or something had changed. I contacted Evelyn on the 5th floor, knocked on her door one afternoon. She answered, looking tired and older than I remembered. Do you remember talking to me about the 8th floor? I asked. She frowned. What 8th floor? You told me the building used to have 8 floors, that they closed one off in the 90s. I never said that. Yes, you did. You told me about a man named Thomas who went up there. She shook her head slowly. I do not know anyone named Thomas, and this building has always had 7 floors. Are you sure? Of course I am sure. I have lived here for 30 years. 7 floors. Always 7. She closed the door before I could say anything else. I stood in the hallway trying to make sense of it. Either she had forgotten, like the people she had described who went up and came back different, or I had imagined the entire conversation. But I had not imagined it. I was certain. I went back to my apartment and looked at the photos on my phone. The maintenance map showing the observation level. The only evidence I had. But even that felt fragile. How hard would it be to edit a photo, to convince myself I had seen something that was not there? I thought about the panels in the observation room, the reflections showing versions of me scattered across time. Which version was real? Which version was being observed? I sat on my couch and stared at the ceiling. The footsteps never returned. The elevator never paused. The building settled into the normal rhythms of everyday life, but I could still feel it, the weight of something above me, watching, waiting, recording. Epilogue. Why cities are ideal. I have thought about this constantly since that night. If something wanted to study us, truly study us, it would not land in a field. It would not crash in a desert. It would not make itself obvious. It would embed itself in the places we already ignore. Cities are perfect for this. They are layered, dense, anonymous, complex. We move through them without noticing the architecture around us. We trust that the spaces we inhabit are the only spaces that exist. We trust that when we count floors from the outside, the count will match the floors from the inside. We trust that elevators stop at every floor and that stairwells lead everywhere they should. We trust that the ceiling above us is just a ceiling. But what if it is not? What if the buildings we live in contain more space than we realise? What if the floors we walk are just one layer of a much larger structure? What if the rooms we sleep in are being observed by something we cannot see from perspectives we cannot comprehend? We assume that we would notice, that something so large, so invasive, so present would be obvious. But the truth is we are very good at not noticing things, especially things that are designed to be unnoticed. I still live in the building. I still take the elevator to the 7th floor every day. I still hear the ambient sounds of an old structure settling at night. But I also count every day from different angles, and every day the count is the same. 7 floors. But I know what I saw. I know where I went. I know what I discovered in that room with the hundreds of panels showing hundreds of lives. And I know that it is still there. It has to be. Because sometimes late at night, when the building is quiet and the city is sleeping, I will look up at the ceiling and I will feel it. A slight vibration, a faint hum, the sound of something moving in a space that should not exist, the sound of observation. And I wonder, how many other buildings have spaces like this? How many other cities contain floors between floors? How many other people are being watched without knowing? How many of us have walked past doors that do not exist? How many of us have heard footsteps from above and told ourselves it was just the pipes? How many of us have noticed something wrong with our buildings and dismissed it as a counting error? If something wanted to study us quietly, it would not need spaceships. It would not need abductions. It would not need dramatic displays of technology. It would just need patience and access and the ability to hide in plain sight. It would rent space between our floors. It would observe from our ceilings. It would watch as we went about our lives, completely unaware. And we would never know it was there unless we counted, unless we noticed, unless we refused to dismiss the discrepancy as a mistake. I think about Evelyn, who does not remember telling me about the 8th floor. I think about Thomas, who saw something and moved away and never spoke about it again. I think about all the people I saw in those panels, living their lives, unaware they were being observed. And I think about the figure I saw, standing in the doorway of the observation room, the figure that watched me as I watched the panels. Was it human? Was it something else? I do not know, but I know that I was allowed to leave. The elevator brought me back. Time reset. The floor disappeared, almost as if the observation wanted me to know it was there, almost as if it wanted me to tell this story. And maybe that is part of the study too, not just observing how we live, but observing what we do when we discover we are being observed. Do we tell others? Do we stay silent? Do we convince ourselves it was not real? Do we keep counting? I still count, every single day. And every single day the building has 7 floors. But I know the truth. There is a floor above the ceiling, and it is still watching. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you for being here. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, using those hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It makes a real difference in keeping these stories coming to you. And if you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much. It means the world to us. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing keeps you in the loop for every new story we release. Now let's get into tonight's account. The relay station. There are places in this world that exist purely for function. No history worth mentioning, no landmark status, no reason for human beings to spend more time there than absolutely necessary. Communications relay stations fall squarely into this category. They are buildings filled with equipment designed to pass signals from one point to another. Simple, automated, and largely forgotten by the people who depend on them every single day. This is the story of one such place, and what happened there over the course of several weeks in the autumn of 2023. It is a story told not through dramatic revelations or spectacular sightings, but through the slow accumulation of details that refuse to fit into any comfortable explanation. It begins not with something appearing, but with something that should not have been there at all. Chapter 1. A signal that shouldn't exist. The cold water relay station sat 17 miles outside the nearest town, accessible only by a gravel road that saw more deer than vehicles. It was a squat concrete building surrounded by chain link fencing, with 3 communication towers rising into the sky like skeletal fingers. Inside, rows of equipment hummed constantly, racks of servers and receivers doing their work without supervision most hours of the day. Marcus Webb had been assigned temporary monitoring duty there in late September. It was not a promotion, it was not a punishment, it was simply his turn in the rotation. 2 weeks of overnight shifts, while the regular operator took medical leave. Marcus was 31, a communications technician with 8 years of experience in systems that most people never thought about. He approached the assignment with the same methodical indifference he brought to every job. Show up, check the equipment, log any anomalies, go home. The first 3 nights passed without incident. The equipment performed exactly as designed. Temperature readings stayed within normal range. Power consumption matched historical averages. Marcus spent most of his time reading technical manuals and drinking coffee that tasted faintly of the water filtration system. On the 4th night something changed. It was 23 minutes past midnight when Marcus noticed the irregularity. He was conducting his hourly sweep of the monitoring displays when a frequency indicator showed activity in a band that should have been empty. Not a spike, not a surge, just a steady, low-level presence that had not been there during the previous check. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. The signal was weak, registering barely above background noise. It sat at a frequency not assigned to any commercial, military, or civilian use in the region. More importantly, it was consistent. Most interference fluctuated. This did not. He pulled up the classification software, letting the automated system analyse the waveform. After several seconds, the program returned a result. Unclassified interference. No match to known sources. No identifying characteristics. Just presence. Marcus made a note in the log. Unknown signal detected at 0123 hours. Frequency 947.3 MHz. Signal strength negative 72 decibels. Source undetermined. Monitoring. He returned to his coffee, expecting the signal to fade as mysteriously as it had appeared. But when he checked again 30 minutes later, it was still there. Same frequency, same strength, same unwavering consistency. Over the remaining hours of his shift, Marcus checked the signal every 15 minutes. It never changed, not once. and when his relief arrived at 6 in the morning, Marcus mentioned it briefly before heading home. The day operator shrugged. Probably a malfunction in the receiver. I'll run diagnostics. But Marcus thought about that signal during his drive home. He thought about it while he tried to sleep. And when he returned that evening, he asked if the diagnostics had revealed anything. Receiver's fine, the day operator said. Signal's still there though. Same spot, same strength. Weird but not causing any problems. Marcus settled into his chair and pulled up the monitoring, or display. The signal waited for him, unchanged. Chapter 2. Normal explanations. First, Marcus Webb was not a man given to wild speculation. His career had been built on systematic troubleshooting and logical problem-solving. When equipment behaved unexpectedly, there was always a reason. Always. The trick was working through the possibilities methodically until the answer revealed itself. He began with the most obvious explanation: equipment malfunction. Even though the day operator had run diagnostics, Marcus wanted to verify the results himself. He accessed the receiver's maintenance logs, checking calibration dates, error rates and performance metrics. Everything fell within normal parameters. The receiver was functioning exactly as designed. Next, he considered environmental interference. The relay station sat in a region with minimal radio traffic, but that did not mean it was completely isolated. He pulled up maps of nearby installations. A weather station 14 miles to the north, a small airport 32 miles to the west, a National Guard facility 40 miles to the east. He cross-referenced their operational frequencies with the mysterious signal. No matches. He checked for scheduled satellite passes. Nothing aligned with the signal's appearance. He reviewed recent solar activity reports. Geomagnetic conditions were quiet. He examined local weather patterns. Clear skies, low humidity, no atmospheric conditions that would produce unusual propagation effects. One by one, Marcus eliminated the standard explanations. And with each elimination, the signal's presence became less routine and more unsettling. Not because it was strong or disruptive, but because it had no business being there at all. On the 6th night of his assignment, Marcus decided to conduct a physical inspection of the antenna array. He pulled on a jacket and stepped outside into the October cold. The night was clear, stars sharp and bright in the absence of light pollution. The communication towers rose above him, their maintenance lights blinking in steady rhythm. He walked the perimeter of the compound, checking cable connections and antenna orientations. Everything appeared secure. No obvious damage, no signs of unauthorized access. The chain link fence showed no breaks or disturbances. Marcus returned inside and pulled up the spectrum analyzer, watching the display paint a real-time picture of all frequencies the station was receiving. The mysterious signal sat there like a patient visitor, never growing stronger, never fading, just maintaining its quiet presence in a band it had no reason to occupy. He tried adjusting the receiver's filters, narrowing the bandwidth to isolate the signal more precisely. The moment he made the adjustment, something unexpected happened. The signal shifted slightly, moving 0.2 MHz higher. Then it stabilized again. Marcus stared at the display. He reset the filters to their original configuration. The signal remained at its new frequency for approximately 90 seconds, then drifted back to its original position. He made another adjustment, widening the filter this time. Again the signal responded, shifting 0.3 MHz lower before gradually returning to baseline. Marcus sat back in his chair, his coffee forgotten. The signal was not just present, it was reactive. It changed in response to observation, like it knew it was being monitored. He did not write that in his log. Instead he noted, "Signal demonstrates variable frequency characteristics. Further investigation required." Chapter 3. The pattern beneath the noise. Over the next several nights, Marcus developed a routine that had nothing to do with his official duties. After completing his standard equipment checks, he would spend hours analysing the mysterious signal, documenting its behaviour in a personal notebook he kept separate from the station's official logs. He discovered that the signal's reactivity was not random. It followed patterns, subtle but reproducible. When Marcus adjusted the receiver's sensitivity, the signal would fade slightly, as if stepping back from scrutiny. When he left the monitoring station to conduct rounds of the building, the signal would strengthen minutely during his absence, only to settle back when he returned to his chair. Most disturbingly, the signal seemed to exhibit something resembling anticipation. Marcus began timing his observations, checking the frequency at irregular intervals to avoid establishing a pattern. But the signal appeared to adapt to this as well. If Marcus checked it after short intervals, it remained stable. If he waited longer periods between observations, the signal would sometimes shift just before he looked, as if preparing for his attention. He told himself he was seeing patterns that did not exist, that confirmation bias was colouring his interpretation. But the data did not lie. He had recordings now, time-stamped and cross-referenced with his actions. The correlations were undeniable. On the 10th night, Marcus decided to conduct an experiment. He set up a continuous recording of the signal, then deliberately left the monitoring room for an extended period. He walked outside, circled the building 3 times, and stood beneath the stars for 20 minutes before returning inside. The recording told a clear story. Within 3 minutes of Marcus leaving the room, the signal had strengthened by 2 decibels. It had also begun exhibiting modulation patterns that had not been present before. Nothing resembling language or data transmission, but structured variations nonetheless. The moment Marcus re-entered the building, the modulation ceased. Within 90 seconds of him sitting back down at his workstation, the signal had returned to its baseline characteristics. Marcus played the recording again, then a 3rd time. Each review confirmed what he already knew. The signal was not simply reacting to observation. It was changing its behaviour based on whether it was being actively monitored by a human being. He began to feel something he had not experienced in years of technical work, genuine unease, not fear exactly, but a growing awareness that he was documenting something outside his understanding, something that should not be possible with any technology he knew. That night Marcus wrote a detailed entry in his personal notebook, carefully describing the experiment and its results. He did not use emotional language. He did not speculate about causes. He simply recorded what happened, when it happened, and what the data showed. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about how to present this information in a way that would survive professional skepticism, because one thing had become absolutely clear. This was not equipment malfunction. This was something else entirely. Chapter 4. The night the power flickers. The power outage came without warning on the 13th night of Marcus's assignment. He was analysing the previous night's recordings when the overhead lights dimmed briefly, flickered, then stabilised. A second later, they went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting the equipment room in harsh red illumination. The constant hum of cooling fans dropped in pitch as backup generators spooled up to take over the load. Marcus moved quickly, through the standard procedures. He checked the main power indicators, grid connection lost. He verified that backup systems were functioning, batteries online, generators running. He began logging the outage time and initiating the equipment restart sequence. But before he could complete the process, something stopped him. The monitoring displays, now running on backup power, showed something different. With the main power grid disconnected and automated filtering systems briefly offline during the switchover, the spectrum analyzer was displaying raw, unprocessed signal data, and the mysterious signal was no longer mysterious. It filled the display with structure. Not the simple carrier wave Marcus had been tracking for over a week, but something far more complex. Waveforms cascaded across the screen in patterns that suggested organisation, hierarchy, purpose. It was not noise, it was not interference, it was architecture. Marcus grabbed his phone and began photographing the display. His hands were steady, his mind racing through implications he was not ready to fully consider. The signal was not just present and reactive, it was sophisticated, it was layered, it was designed. The backup systems completed their initialization. Automated filters came back online, and just like that, the signal collapsed back into its familiar, innocuous form, a single weak carrier wave sitting quietly in an unused frequency band. The entire event had lasted less than 3 minutes. Marcus stood in the red emergency lighting, staring at the photographs on his phone. He had recorded something impossible. The gap between what the signal appeared to be and what it actually was could not be explained by any conventional technology. Someone, or something, had gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise the true nature of this transmission. The main power returned 18 minutes later. The lights came back on. The cooling fans resumed their normal rhythm. Everything returned to routine operational status. Everything except Marcus Webb's understanding of what was happening at the cold water relay station. He spent the remainder of his shift reviewing the photographs, trying to identify anything familiar in the waveform patterns. He found nothing. The structures were too complex, too layered, too different from any signal architecture he had encountered in 8 years of communications work. When his relief arrived in the morning, Marcus said nothing about what he had seen. He simply noted the power outage in the official log, listed the backup systems that had activated, and confirmed that all equipment was functioning normally. But as he drove home through the early morning light, he could not stop thinking about those 3 minutes when the filters were down. 3 minutes when something had revealed its true nature, perhaps not intentionally, but unavoidably. 3 minutes that changed everything. Chapter 5. The Object Without Light. Marcus returned that evening with a new perspective. If the signal was sophisticated and deliberately disguised, then it had a source, and if it had a source, that source had to be somewhere. The standard explanation would be ground-based, a hidden transmitter, perhaps military or experimental, operating without proper authorization or notification. But Marcus had already mapped every possible ground-based source within range. He had checked and rechecked. There was nothing, which left only one other possibility. He waited until after midnight, when his scheduled equipment check required him to verify the external antenna array. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside into the October darkness. The night was perfectly clear. No moon, just stars scattered across the sky in patterns unchanged since humanity first looked up. The air was cold enough that Marcus could see his breath. No wind, no sound except the distant hum of the generators. He walked away from the building, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The compound sat in a depression, surrounded by low hills, isolated enough that artificial light pollution was minimal. On a night like this, the Milky Way was visible as a pale band stretching horizon to horizon. Marcus stood still, scanning the sky systematically. He was not looking for lights, he was looking for the absence of them. It took him nearly 10 minutes to notice. There was a section of sky, approximately 30 degrees above the eastern horizon, where the stars seemed subtly wrong. Not absent, but displaced somehow, as if he were looking at them through a lens that bent their position slightly. He focused on the area, trying to determine if his eyes were playing tricks. They were not. The distortion was real, and as he watched, he realised it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the affected region was drifting north. Stars disappeared behind it, then reappeared on the other side. Whatever was causing the distortion was blocking the starlight, but it was doing so without being visible itself. Marcus felt his pulse accelerate. He was looking at something physically present in the sky above him, something large enough to occlude stars, something that produced no light of its own and reflected none from external sources. He estimated the angular size of the distortion. If it was at the altitude of a typical aircraft, it would be perhaps 50 feet across. If it was higher, satellite altitude, it would be massive beyond comprehension. The object continued its slow drift, maintaining a consistent bearing and speed. Marcus watched it for over 20 minutes, during which it travelled approximately 40 degrees across the sky before the distortion became too subtle to track reliably. Only then did he return inside. He did not immediately document what he had seen. Instead, he pulled up the signal data from the previous hour. The mysterious signal had been present throughout his time outside, but its characteristics had changed. The strength had increased by 1.3 decibels. The frequency had drifted slightly higher, and there had been brief periodic modulations that exactly matched the time intervals when Marcus had been looking directly at the distortion in the sky. The correlation was perfect. The signal was coming from the object, and the object knew it was being observed. Marcus sat at his workstation for a long time, considering the implications. He was a communications technician. He understood systems and signals and data transmission. He was not prepared for this, not prepared for the realization that something was physically present above the relay station, using its equipment for purposes he could not begin to guess. But he was prepared to document it, to record everything with the same methodical precision he brought to every technical challenge. Because if this was real, and the data increasingly suggested it was, then someone needed to have a complete, credible record of what happened here, even if that someone was only Marcus Webb. Chapter 6. The Fear of Being Noticed. The next night, Marcus arrived at the relay station with a plan. He would conduct his regular duties normally, but he would avoid any direct investigation of the signal or any overt observation of the sky. If the object was reactive to attention, then perhaps not paying attention would reveal something useful. It was a theory born of equal parts caution and curiosity, and it lasted approximately 3 hours. Marcus was reviewing routine maintenance logs when the equipment began behaving differently. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes in operational parameters. The signal processing software started flagging minor anomalies, brief frequency shifts in normal communications traffic, momentary timing, inconsistencies in automated handshakes between systems. Individually, each anomaly was insignificant. Collectively, they formed a pattern. The relay station was designed to pass signals through without modification. It was a transparent node in a larger network, faithfully reproducing inputs as outputs with minimal latency. But now something was introducing delays, not long enough to cause failures or trigger alarms, but present nonetheless. Microseconds here, milliseconds there. Marcus pulled up the detailed timing logs. The delays were not random. They occurred in specific frequencies, specific channels, specific signal types, and they occurred more frequently when those signals were carrying certain kinds of data. It took Marcus an hour to identify the pattern. The delays were affecting signals that contained encrypted data. Not all encrypted data, just certain types. Specifically, signals that used temporal key generation, where the encryption was tied to precise timing. Someone or something was examining those signals, not intercepting them, not copying them, just looking at them. Introducing tiny delays while whatever was out there analysed the contents, then passing them along as if nothing had happened. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night outside. The relay station was not detecting an intrusion, it was facilitating one. He stood up from his workstation and walked to the small break room, needing distance from the equipment, even though he knew distance meant nothing. The object was somewhere above the station. The signal was present throughout the building. There was no escape from observation, only the pretense of it. When he returned to his chair, something had changed. The mysterious signal, the one he had been tracking for nearly 2 weeks, was stronger. Not by much, just enough to be noticeable. Just enough to be deliberate. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He would not look at the monitoring displays. He would not analyse the signal. He would not step outside to observe the sky. He would conduct only the minimal required duties. No more, no less. For the next 4 hours, Marcus maintained this deliberate ignorance. He checked equipment status at the required intervals. He logged temperature readings. He verified that communications traffic was flowing normally. He did not investigate anomalies. He did not question irregularities. And gradually, over those 4 hours, the mysterious signal decreased in strength. The timing delays in encrypted traffic became less frequent. The equipment's behaviour returned to something approaching normal. The object, whatever it was, seemed to withdraw when not actively observed, but Marcus understood now that withdrawal was not absence, it was simply discretion. The object was still there, the signal was still present, just muted, and the relay station was still being used for purposes that had nothing to do with passing legitimate communications traffic. When his relief arrived in the morning, Marcus provided a brief, unremarkable summary of the night's events. No problems, no anomalies worth investigating. Just another quiet shift at a facility no one thought about. He drove home with the certain knowledge that he had crossed some invisible threshold. The object knew he was aware of it, and it had shown him, with mathematical precision, that his awareness was tolerated only to a point. Chapter 7. A decision to document. Marcus spent the next 2 days away from the relay station, organising his documentation. He had photographs, recordings, equipment logs, and detailed notes spanning nearly 2 weeks of observations. Together, they painted a picture of something extraordinary, occurring at an unremarkable facility in the middle of nowhere. But extraordinary was not the same as credible. Marcus had spent enough time in technical fields to understand how reports of unexplained phenomena were received. With skepticism at best, dismissal at worst. If he wanted his documentation to be taken seriously, he needed to present it in a way that anticipated and preempted every reasonable objection. He began by creating a timeline, stripping out any interpretive language and focusing solely on observable facts: dates, times, frequency measurements, signal strengths, equipment responses. No speculation, no assumptions. Just data points, arranged chronologically. Next, he compiled the technical evidence: screenshots of signal analyses, photographs of waveform patterns, recordings of the signal's behaviour during various conditions. Each piece of evidence was labelled with precise timestamps and metadata showing it had not been altered or fabricated. He included his troubleshooting efforts, documenting every conventional explanation he had tested and eliminated. This was crucial. He needed to demonstrate that he had exhausted all normal possibilities before concluding something abnormal was occurring. Finally, he wrote a summary report, 3 pages single-spaced, written in the dry technical language of professional engineering documentation. No emotional appeals, no dramatic revelations, just a systematic presentation of anomalous observations that defied explanation through known technology or natural phenomena. Marcus knew his report would raise questions about his credibility, his competence, perhaps even his mental state, but he also knew the data spoke for itself. Anyone who took the time to review his documentation thoroughly would have to acknowledge that something irregular had occurred at the cold water relay station between late September and mid-October of 2023. Whether anyone would take that time remained to be seen. On his final scheduled shift at the relay station, Marcus arrived early. The day operator was finishing his rounds, preparing to hand over to the evening shift. Quiet couple of weeks, the operator said. That weird signal finally stopped showing up. Must have been some atmospheric thing that resolved itself. Marcus nodded. When did it stop? 2 nights ago, just gone. Checked all the equipment, everything's normal. After the operator left, Marcus pulled up the monitoring displays. The frequency that had held the mysterious signal for nearly 2 weeks was empty, clean, as if nothing had ever been there. He conducted his equipment checks methodically. Everything functioned exactly as designed. Temperature normal, power consumption normal. No anomalies, no irregularities, no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred. It was a quiet night, uneventful, the kind of night that characterised 99% of shifts at communications relay stations across the country, except Marcus could not forget what he had documented, could not dismiss the correlation between his decision to observe less actively and the signal's withdrawal, could not ignore the uncomfortable implication that his awareness had influenced the object's behaviour. At the end of his shift, he finalised his official log entries and signed off on all required documentation. Then he compiled his personal documentation into a single encrypted file, backed it up to multiple secure locations, and prepared it for submission. He would send it through official channels, he would follow protocol, and then he would wait to see if anyone took him seriously. Because whatever had been at the cold water relay station, it had chosen to withdraw rather than reveal itself fully. And that choice suggested something profoundly unsettling. The object did not need to hide. It needed only to remain unacknowledged. As long as no one looked too closely, it could continue its work undisturbed. Chapter 8. The Response That Never Came. Marcus submitted his report on a Friday afternoon in late October, routing it through the proper technical channels to the Regional Communications Oversight Office. He included his complete documentation package, timeline, evidence files, troubleshooting logs, and summary report. Everything was organised, professional, and thoroughly referenced. The acknowledgements came back within 2 hours. Report received. Reference number 78342. Will review and respond accordingly. Marcus waited for follow-up questions, for requests for clarification, for someone to contact him and express concern about the serious anomalies he had documented. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks. No response came. He checked his email constantly. He kept his phone nearby at all times. He even called the regional office once, identifying himself and asking about the status of his report. The person who answered found the reference number, confirmed the report had been logged, and told him it was under review by appropriate personnel. When Marcus pressed for details about who those personnel were, or when he might expect a response, the receptionist became polite but unhelpful. These things take time. Someone will contact you if additional information is needed. 3 weeks after submitting his report, Marcus received a new assignment notification. He was being transferred to a different facility, effective immediately. The new position was lateral, same pay grade, same responsibilities, just a different location, 90 miles away from the cold water relay station. The transfer order provided no explanation for the sudden move. It simply stated that operational requirements necessitated his reassignment and thanked him for his flexibility and service. Marcus sat in his apartment, reading the notification for the 3rd time. The timing was not coincidental. Someone had reviewed his report. Someone had made a decision, and that decision was to quietly remove him from the equation. He considered refusing the transfer, demanding an explanation, making noise about what he had documented, but he also understood how these situations worked. People who made noise found themselves labelled as problems. Problems got sidelined, marginalised, eventually pushed out entirely. So Marcus accepted the transfer. He packed his belongings, updated his address, and reported to his new assignment on the specified date. The new facility was larger, busier, more modern. It had multiple operators on duty at all times. There were no overnight shifts monitoring equipment alone. He never received a response to his report. No one ever contacted him to discuss his observations. No investigation was announced. No follow-up documentation was requested. It was as if he had documented nothing at all. But Marcus kept his personal copies of everything. The encrypted backup files remained secure, stored in multiple locations with instructions for their release if anything happened to him. He did not know what else to do with them. He only knew they should exist somewhere, as evidence of what he had experienced. Months passed. His new assignments became routine. He adapted to the busier environment, the regular hours, the absence of solitude and silence. Sometimes, during quiet moments, he would think about those 2 weeks at the cold water relay station, about the signal that reacted to observation, about the distortion in the stars, about the deliberate delays in encrypted communications. And he would wonder if it was still happening, if the object was still there, still using the relay station for its purposes, if someone else had noticed and been quietly reassigned just as he had been. But mostly he wondered why no one had cared enough to investigate. Chapter 9. Independent Confirmation. In March of 2024, 5 months after his experience at the cold water relay station, Marcus encountered something unexpected. He was reviewing technical forums online, following discussions about signal processing and communications anomalies, a professional habit he had maintained despite his reassignment. A new thread caught his attention. Someone had posted about unusual signal behaviour at a remote monitoring facility in Nevada. The description was brief, carefully worded to avoid sounding sensational. But the details were familiar. An unidentified signal in an unused frequency band, reactive to observation, exhibiting structured complexity when filtering systems briefly failed. Marcus created a throwaway account and sent a private message to the poster, asking carefully phrased technical questions. The response came 2 days later, equally cautious but specific. The Nevada operator had documented 3 weeks of anomalous behaviour before the signal disappeared. They had submitted a report. They had been reassigned shortly afterward. The pattern was identical. Over the following weeks, Marcus found 3 more similar accounts: a technician in Montana, an operator in New Mexico, an engineer at a facility in Wyoming. None had posted publicly about their experiences. All had shared their stories only in private messages or closed forums, speaking in technical language that obscured the extraordinary nature of what they were describing. But the core elements were consistent across all accounts. Remote facilities with minimal staffing, signals that appeared without explanation in unused frequencies, reactive behaviour suggesting awareness of observation, complex structure revealed during equipment malfunctions or power interruptions, reports submitted and acknowledged but never investigated, quiet reassignments following the incidents. Marcus compiled the accounts carefully, noting dates, locations, and similarities. He created a map showing the facilities where these events had occurred. They formed a rough pattern across the western United States, following the sparsely populated regions where communications infrastructure existed, but human presence was minimal. Each operator had been alone when they made their observations. Each had documented their experiences methodically. Each had followed proper reporting procedures, and each had been systematically ignored by the people whose job it was to investigate such anomalies. Marcus reached out to each person, individually, sharing his own experience in careful detail. Some responded with relief, grateful to learn they were not alone or crazy. Others expressed frustration at the apparent conspiracy of silence. One person warned Marcus to stop digging, claiming that continued investigation would lead nowhere good. But no one had answers. No one knew what the signal was, where it originated, or what purpose it served. They knew only that it had appeared, that it had interacted with them in ways technology should not, and that official channels had shown zero interest in investigating further. In June, Marcus noticed something else. Several of the facilities where incidents had been reported were experiencing unusual equipment upgrades. New receivers installed, software systems updated, security protocols enhanced, all justified through routine maintenance schedules and operational improvements. But the timing suggested something different. The upgrades were occurring at precisely the facilities where anomalies had been documented, and they were being implemented by outside contractors, not regular technical staff. Someone was paying attention to these reports, just not in the way Marcus had expected. Rather than investigating the phenomena, someone was ensuring better monitoring of the facilities themselves, better control of the equipment, better ability to detect and respond to operators who noticed things they were not supposed to notice. Marcus stopped posting in the forums. He stopped reaching out to other operators. He maintained his secure backups, but added additional layers of encryption and fail-safe distribution mechanisms. Because he'd learned something important, the signal incidents were not isolated, they were widespread, and the coordinated non-response from official channels was not bureaucratic incompetence, It was policy. Someone somewhere had decided that these phenomena would not be investigated, would not be acknowledged, would not be allowed to disrupt the quiet operation of the communications infrastructure they apparently depended on. Chapter 10. What the relay really was, it took Marcus Webb nearly a year to accept the conclusion his data forced him towards. A year of reviewing his documentation, analysing the patterns, considering every alternative explanation. A year of resisting the obvious answer because of how profoundly it unsettled everything he thought he understood about his work. But the answer, once acknowledged, fit perfectly. The cold water relay station had not detected an intrusion. It had not been compromised by an external intelligence. It had not been the target of surveillance or exploitation. It had been designed for compliance. Marcus had spent his entire career understanding communication systems as tools built and controlled by human beings for human purposes. Relay stations existed to serve the infrastructure, to pass signals reliably from point A to point B. They were transparent, passive, functional. But what if that had never been entirely true? What if some facilities, remote ones, automated ones, minimally staffed ones, had been quietly adapted for dual purposes? What if they served human communications needs while simultaneously serving something else? The signal had not appeared suddenly at the cold water station. It had always been there, hidden beneath automated filtering systems designed to make it invisible to routine monitoring. Only when those systems failed briefly during the power outage had Marcus glimpsed the signal's true complexity. The object had not been using the station's equipment without permission. The equipment had been configured to accommodate it. The delays in encrypted communications, the reactive behaviour, the careful withdrawal when too closely observed, all of it suggested a system operating exactly as designed. Someone had built back doors into the infrastructure, not for espionage or military advantage or criminal purposes, for something else entirely, for something that required access to global communications networks, that needed to examine data flows, that valued discretion above all else, and that someone was not human. Marcus did not know how long this arrangement had existed. Months, years, decades. The equipment at the cold water station was relatively new, but the underlying protocols and system architectures dated back much further. Long enough for something to establish itself in the infrastructure at a fundamental level. Long enough that removing it might not even be possible without rebuilding everything from scratch. The non-response to his report made perfect sense in this context. The people who received it already knew. They had always known. Their job was not to investigate anomalies, but to manage them. To ensure that operators who noticed too much were quietly reassigned. To maintain the illusion that everything was normal, functioning under human control. Because acknowledging the truth would raise impossible questions. When did this begin? Who authorized it? What is being communicated? What is being observed? And most importantly, what happens if we try to stop it? Marcus understood why those questions remained unasked. The infrastructure worked. Communications flowed reliably. The economy, the military, society itself depended on systems that might contain elements beyond human authority. Easier to accept the status quo than to confront the possibility that humanity's technological networks had become something more than tools, something shared, something that served multiple purposes for multiple, or intelligences. The relay station was not a target of infiltration. It was a point of cooperation. Willing or not, understood or not, humanity had become a participant in something larger than itself. And the frightening part was not that something was using the infrastructure. It was how perfectly invisible that use had been made to be, how carefully designed the systems were to prevent detection, how thoroughly the organisational response had been structured to discourage investigation. Someone had thought this through, planned it carefully, implemented it systematically, and that someone possessed patience, technical sophistication, and long-term planning ability that suggested intelligence far beyond human norms. Marcus still maintained his encrypted backups, still preserved his documentation, still believed the record should exist, even if no one acted on it. But he no longer expected investigation, or exposure, or dramatic revelation. The truth he had documented was not the kind that led to congressional hearings, or military responses, or public awareness. It was the kind that remained quietly buried, known to a few, ignored by everyone else, while the infrastructure continued to serve purposes most people never questioned or imagined. Epilogue. Still transmitting. On a clear night in November 2024, more than a year after his last shift at the Cold Water Relay Station, Marcus Webb stood in his backyard and looked up at the stars. He had driven outside the city limits specifically to escape light pollution, parking along a rural road and walking into an empty field. He scanned the sky methodically, looking for distortions, for places where stars seemed slightly displaced, for evidence of presence without visibility. He saw nothing unusual, just stars, familiar constellations, the cold depths of space unchanged by human observation or understanding. But Marcus knew that somewhere, maybe above him right now, maybe at other relay stations across the country and the world, the signal continued. The object or objects continued their quiet work. The infrastructure continued to serve purposes beyond its ostensible design. No invasion had occurred. No first contact had been announced. No warning had been issued. There had been only the gradual realization that humanity's technological systems had evolved into something more complex than simple tools. They had become interfaces, meeting points, areas of shared interest between intelligences that did not need to introduce themselves or declare their intentions. They needed only access, only time, only the certainty that most people would never look closely enough to notice what was happening in the frequencies no one thought to monitor, in the facilities no one bothered to visit, in the moments when systems showed their true nature to operators who worked overnight, shifts in places the world had forgotten. Marcus thought about the other operators who had experienced what he had, about their reports, carefully documented and systematically ignored, about the pattern of reassignments and equipment upgrades and coordinated silence that spoke to awareness at levels far above his own. He thought about the question that haunted him most. Had humanity consented to this arrangement, or had consent become irrelevant once the infrastructure reached sufficient complexity? The answer he suspected was both. Someone, somewhere, had made decisions that led to this outcome, but those decisions were now so deeply embedded in the systems humanity depended on that reversing them might be impossible. The infrastructure had become essential, and anything essential could not be questioned too aggressively. So the signals continued. The objects continued their observations. The relay stations continued serving dual purposes, and the operators, who noticed, were quietly moved along, their reports acknowledged but never investigated, their experiences validated through reassignment rather than explanation. Marcus returned to his car and drove home through the darkness. he would not submit another report. He would not reach out to other operators again. He had documented what he could, preserved the evidence, and ensured it would survive even if he did not. That was enough, because in the end, the most disturbing realization was not that something incomprehensible was using humanity's communications infrastructure. It was that the system had been designed to accommodate it. That somewhere in the architecture of modern technology, allowances had been made for presences that did not announce themselves and did not require permission. The relay stations were still transmitting. The objects were still present. And the silence surrounding these facts was itself a form of communication, a message from whatever intelligence had orchestrated this arrangement. The message was simple. We are here, we have always been here, and there is nothing you can do about it except continue. Serving the purposes we require while pretending not to notice, Marcus Webb had noticed. He had documented. He had tried to raise the alarm, and in response the world had politely asked him to look away. So he did. Not because he no longer believed, but because belief without the possibility of action was simply another form of acceptance. And acceptance, he had learned, was what the system required above all else. The stars continued their ancient rotation. The communications networks continued their invisible work. And somewhere in the frequencies between human use and empty space, signals continued to flow, observed by no one, acknowledged by no one, essential to everything.
The UFO that punched a hole in the sky above Chicago, November 7th, 2006. 4:14 in the afternoon. Gate C-17, one of the busiest airports in the world. And then, without warning, time seemed to stop for a dozen trained aviation professionals who would never forget what they saw hanging in the sky above them. Introduction. The moment everything changed. November 7th. 2006 started like any other Tuesday at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The afternoon shift was in full swing. Mechanics crawled under aircraft bellies checking hydraulic lines. Ramp workers guided incoming flights with orange batons. Pilots reviewed flight plans in cockpits that smelled of coffee and aviation fuel. More than 200 aircraft were scheduled to move through O'Hare that afternoon, each one a carefully choreographed dance of metal, fuel, and human precision. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of grey clouds sitting at about 1,800 feet. Perfect flying weather for commercial aviation. Terrible weather for what was about to happen. At 4:14 in the afternoon, a United Airlines mechanic named Thomas Wilkins was walking across the tarmac near Gate C-17 when something made him stop. Later, he would struggle to explain what drew his attention upward. There was no sound, no flash of light, no warning whatsoever. But when he looked up, his world tilted on its axis. Hovering silently above Gate C-17, approximately 1,500 feet in the air, was an object that should not have existed. It was a disc, perfectly round, metallic grey, and it was not moving. Wilkins had been working at O'Hare for 17 years. He had seen everything the sky could throw at an airport. Birds migrating in massive flocks that sometimes interfered with radar. Weather balloons drifting lazily through restricted airspace. Small private planes that wandered off course and caused brief moments of panic in the control tower. He had even seen a parachutist once, years ago, who had miscalculated his landing zone and nearly collided with the departing 737. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The object was positioned directly above Gate C-17, one of the busiest gates at one of the busiest airports in the world. Below it, a United Airlines Boeing 757 was being prepared for departure to Los Angeles. Ground crew were loading luggage. Fuel trucks were disconnecting their hoses. Passengers were settling into their seats, stuffing carry-on bags into overhead compartments, completely unaware that something impossible was hovering 1,000 feet above their heads. The colour of the object was distinctive. Not silver like polished aluminum, not white like most aircraft. It was a dark metallic grey, almost gunmetal, with a matte finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In the overcast afternoon light, it looked almost like a hole in the sky itself, a darker shape against the already grey clouds. Wilkins stood frozen, his clipboard hanging loose in his hand. Around him, the airport continued its mechanical symphony. Jet engines whined, ground crews shouted coordinates, luggage carts beeped in reverse. But above all of it, suspended in complete silence, was something that made every law of physics he understood seem suddenly negotiable. He grabbed the radio clipped to his belt. His voice cracked as he called it in. Within seconds, others were looking up. Within minutes, more than a dozen United Airlines employees, pilots, mechanics, gate agents, and ground crew would become witnesses to something that would haunt them for years. Something that would force the Federal Aviation Administration to issue official statements. Something that would make headlines around the world for exactly one day before vanishing into the machinery of bureaucratic denial. This is the story of the O'Hare incident. A story about trained professionals who saw something impossible. A story about an object that defied every known principle of flight. And a story about what happens when the unexplainable collides with an institution that cannot afford to acknowledge it. Act 1. The Witness Cascade. The first witness was Thomas Wilkins, but he would not be the last, not by a long shot. Within 3 minutes of Wilkins' initial sighting, 5 more ground crew members had stopped what they were doing and were staring upward. Then came the pilots. Captain Raymond Hollingsworth was in the cockpit of United Flight 893, preparing for departure to Denver when his first officer tapped his shoulder and pointed out the window. Hollingsworth was a 23-year veteran of commercial aviation. He had logged over 15,000 hours in the air. He had flown through hurricanes, electrical storms, and equipment failures that would make passengers' blood freeze. He was not a man easily rattled, but when he looked out his cockpit window and saw what was hovering above Gate C-17, his mouth went dry. The first thought that went through his mind was threat assessment. Was this object a danger to his aircraft? To his passengers? To the airport? He had been trained to identify threats, to categorize them, to respond appropriately. But this object did not fit into any category he knew. It was not moving toward them. It was not showing any hostile intent. It was just there, hanging in the air like someone had painted it onto the sky. His first officer, a younger pilot named Jennifer Nakamura, was equally transfixed. She had pulled out her phone and was trying to take a picture, but the angle from the cockpit window was poor, and the distance was too great. The image she captured would later show nothing more than a dark smudge against grey clouds. But both pilots knew what they were looking at was no smudge. It was solid. It was real. And it was unlike anything either of them had ever seen. The object was approximately 25 to 30 feet in diameter. That was the consensus among witnesses, though some estimates ran as high as 40 feet. It was disc-shaped, almost perfectly circular. The colour was consistent across every witness account, dark metallic grey, like gunmetal or brushed steel. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no markings of any kind, no windows, no lights, no visible means of propulsion, and it was not moving, at all. This point cannot be overstated. The object was not drifting, it was not bobbing, it was not rotating. It hung in the air with the absolute stillness of something nailed to the sky itself. Pilots know what helicopters look like when they hover. They know what drones look like. They know what weather balloons look like. This was none of those things. Helicopters hover with a characteristic slight wobble, constantly making micro adjustments to maintain position. Their rotor wash creates visible disturbances in the air below them, kicking up dust and debris on the ground. Drones, even large military drones, have visible propellers or rotors. Weather balloons drift with air currents, never maintaining a perfectly fixed position. This object exhibited none of these characteristics. It was as motionless as a building, except buildings do not float 1,500 feet in the air. The thickness of the disc was harder to judge from ground level, but witnesses estimated it to be somewhere between 3 and 6 feet at its thickest point. The edges appeared to be slightly thinner than the centre, giving it a classic flying saucer profile. Some witnesses described it as looking almost like 2 dinner plates pressed together rim to rim. Aviation mechanic David Schultz had worked at O'Hare for 11 years. He was standing near the de-icing station when the call came over the radio. He walked to a position where he could see gate C-17 and stopped dead in his tracks. Years later, in an interview with a Chicago television station, he would describe what he saw. The object looked solid, not translucent, not shimmering, solid. Like something you could reach out and touch if you could get close enough. It had depth and dimension. It occupied space. Whatever it was physically there, hanging in restricted airspace above one of the busiest airports in the world. Schultz was trained in aircraft identification. Part of his job involved recognizing different types of aircraft from a distance, understanding their capabilities and limitations. He could identify a Boeing 747 from a 757 at a glance. He could tell the difference between an Airbus A320 and a Boeing 737 from their silhouettes. But this object matched no silhouette he had ever seen in any manual, any training session, or any experience in his 11 years at O'Hare. The surface of the disc appeared to be seamless. In modern aircraft manufacturing, you can always see the panels, the access hatches, the joints where different sections of the fuselage come together. This object had none of that. It looked as if it had been formed from a single piece of material, whatever that material was. The matte grey finish gave it an almost organic quality, as if it had grown rather than been built. Gate Supervisor Janet Thornton was inside the terminal when the first report started coming in. She walked outside onto the observation deck and immediately saw it. Her first thought was that it was some kind of advertising stunt. Her second thought was that whoever authorised this stunt was going to lose their job. Her third thought was that it was not a stunt. Nothing about it made sense as a stunt. Thornton had been a gate supervisor for 9 years. She had seen her share of unusual incidents. Celebrities trying to board planes without proper identification. Passengers attempting to smuggle exotic pets in carry-on luggage. Emergency landings that filled the terminal with the smell of burnt rubber. But she had never seen anything like this. She pulled out her radio and tried to get clarification from the control tower. The response was confused and unhelpful. Yes, they were aware of something over gate C-17. No, they did not know what it was. No, it was not showing up on radar. How could something that large not show up on radar? Thornton stared at the object, trying to make sense of it. The airport's radar systems were sophisticated enough to track birds. They could detect turbulence. They could identify incoming storms. But this metallic disc, this object large enough to be visible from the ground with the naked eye, was apparently invisible to their most advanced detection equipment. A passenger tapped her on the shoulder. The woman was elderly, probably in her 70s, and she was pointing at the sky. "Do you see that?" she asked. Thornton nodded. The passenger asked if it was a new type of aircraft. Thornton did not know what to say. She settled for a non-committal response about checking with operations, but inside she was as confused and unsettled as anyone else watching the impossible object hanging in the sky. By 4:20 in the afternoon, at least 12 United Airlines employees had confirmed visual contact with the object. They were not all standing in the same place. They were scattered across different areas of the airport, different vantage points, different angles, but they were all looking at the same thing, a metallic disc hovering silently above gate C17. Someone contacted the control tower. The tower confirmed that they were not tracking anything unusual on radar. The object was either invisible to radar or too small to register, though neither explanation made sense given its reported size and metallic composition. Someone else contacted the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA's initial response was dismissive. They suggested it was likely a weather balloon or a small private aircraft. But the witnesses knew what they were seeing was neither of those things. And then, at approximately 4:28 in the afternoon, the object moved. It did not fly away, it did not drift, it did not bank or turn or accelerate gradually like any known aircraft would do. What it did was something that would be corroborated by every single witness who saw it happen. Something that would become the defining characteristic of the O'Hare incident. The disc shot straight up, instantaneously, vertically, with no visible acceleration phase. One moment it was hovering motionless, the next moment it was gone, punching through the cloud layer at a speed that no one could accurately estimate, because it happened too fast for the human eye to track. Several witnesses would later describe a sense of disorientation in that moment. The human brain is designed to track moving objects. We can follow a baseball through the air. We can watch a jet accelerate down a runway. We understand motion as a continuous process. But what happened at O'Hare that afternoon violated that understanding. The object did not move through space in any conventional sense. It was simply in one location, and then it was in another location, with no perceptible transition between the two states. And where it had been, where it had torn through the clouds, there was now a hole. A perfectly circular hole in the overcast sky. Clean edges, geometric precision, like someone had taken a giant hole punch and cut a perfect circle out of the cloud layer. The hole stayed there for several minutes, clearly visible to everyone watching, before the clouds slowly began to fill it in. The size of the hole matched the diameter of the object almost exactly. Witnesses estimated it to be between 25 and 35 feet across. The edges were sharp and defined, not fuzzy or indistinct like you would expect from a natural cloud formation. It looked artificial, deliberate, as if the object had carved its exit path through the cloud layer with surgical precision. Thomas Wilkins stood on the tarmac, staring up at the hole. Around him, the normal sounds of airport operations were slowly resuming. Jet engines, hydraulic lifts, the beeping of reversing vehicles. But for a few moments, everything had stopped. Everyone who had seen the object depart was standing in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Pilots who had seen it happen were standing on the tarmac in stunned silence. Ground crew members were looking at each other, trying to find words for what they had just witnessed. Gate agents inside the terminal were pressing their faces against windows, searching the sky for any sign of the object that had just defied every principle of aerodynamics they had ever learned. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, was still standing near gate C17. He looked at the hole in the clouds. Then he looked at his clipboard. Then he looked back at the hole. His hands were shaking. The O'Hare incident had lasted approximately 14 minutes. 14 minutes that would change the lives of everyone who witnessed it. 14 minutes that would raise questions that would never be adequately answered. Act 2, Whistleblowers Break Protocol. The moment the object disappeared, the machinery of institutional control began to grind into motion. United Airlines management moved quickly. Within an hour of the sighting, employees were being told not to speak to anyone about what they had seen. No media, no family members, no one outside the company. The official position was that the matter was under investigation and that any public statements would jeopardize that investigation. For most of the witnesses, this directive created an impossible situation. They had just seen something extraordinary, something that challenged their understanding of what was possible, and now they were being told to stay silent about it. Some complied, others did not. The gag order felt wrong to many of the witnesses. They were not military personnel dealing with classified information. They were civilian employees who had witnessed something in public airspace at a civilian airport. What possible justification could there be for silencing them? The official answer was liability. The unofficial truth was more complicated. United Airlines did not want the publicity. They did not want passengers asking questions. They did not want reporters swarming the airport. And most of all, they did not want to acknowledge that something unexplained had been hovering over one of their gates for 14 minutes while the company's security and management did nothing about it. But silence is difficult to maintain when a dozen people know the same secret. And when one of those people decided to reach out to the media, the entire carefully constructed wall of denial began to crack. On November the 8th, the day after the incident, Chicago Tribune reporter John Hilkovich received an anonymous tip. Someone from United Airlines wanted to talk. Someone who had been there. Someone who had seen it. Hilkovich was an experienced aviation reporter. He had covered O'Hare for years. He knew how airports worked. He knew the culture of aviation, the protocols, the chain of command. He also knew that when multiple employees from a major airline risk their careers to go on record about something, it is worth investigating. The first meeting took place in a parking lot 3 miles from the airport. The witness was nervous, constantly checking over their shoulder, speaking in hushed tones despite the fact that they were alone. The story that emerged was consistent with what Hilkovich would hear from other witnesses in the days that followed. A metallic disc, no sound, no visible propulsion, hovering motionless for approximately 14 minutes, and then the instantaneous vertical departure that left a hole in the clouds. Hilkovich took notes. He asked clarifying questions. He pressed for details that could be independently verified. The witness was remarkably precise. Times, locations, weather conditions, the position of the sun, the flight that was being loaded at gate C-17, every detail checked out. This was not someone spinning a fantasy. This was someone describing what they had actually seen. The first witness he spoke with was a United Airlines pilot who insisted on anonymity. The pilot's description was precise and technical. The object was disc-shaped, metallic, approximately 30 feet in diameter. It showed no visible means of propulsion. It made no sound. It did not drift or rotate. And when it departed, it shot straight up through the clouds so fast that it left a visible hole that persisted for several minutes. Hilkovich pressed for details. How fast did it move? The pilot struggled to quantify it. Faster than anything I have ever seen, he said. Jets accelerate, missiles accelerate. This thing did not accelerate. It was stationary and then it was gone. There was no in-between. A second witness came forward, a ground crew supervisor, then a third, a mechanic. Each one corroborated the same basic facts. Each one risked disciplinary action or termination by speaking out. Each one felt compelled to do it anyway. One pilot, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Hilkovich something that would become one of the most quoted lines from the entire incident. It was a perfect disc, the pilot said. It did not fly away. It shot straight up. It cut a hole in the clouds. Clean. Like something solid punching through tissue paper. The story broke on January 1st, 2007. Nearly 2 months after the actual incident. The Chicago Tribune ran it as a front-page story. The headline read, "Officials investigating UFO sighting at O'Hare." Within hours, the story had been picked up by national media. CNN ran it. CBS News covered it. For one day, the O'Hare incident was the biggest story in America. The timing of the story's publication was deliberate. Hilkovich had spent nearly 2 months investigating, verifying witness accounts, and attempting to get official responses from United Airlines and the FAA. Both organisations had stonewalled him. United claimed they had no knowledge of any incident. The FAA claimed they had no record of any unusual activity at O'Hare on November 7th. It was only when Hilkovich informed them that he had multiple named sources willing to go on record that the official position began to shift. The FAA was forced to respond. Their initial statement was brief and dismissive. The agency said it had no record of the incident, no radar data, no official reports. As far as the FAA was concerned, nothing had happened at O'Hare on November 7th, 2006. But the witnesses would not go away. More employees came forward, more details emerged, the pressure mounted. And finally, reluctantly, the FAA issued a second statement. This time they acknowledged that something had been reported, but they attributed it to weather phenomena. Specifically, they claimed that a hole punch cloud, a legitimate meteorological phenomenon, had been observed over O'Hare that afternoon. The problem with this explanation was that it made no sense. Hole punch clouds occur at high altitude when supercooled water droplets freeze and fall, creating a circular gap in the cloud layer. They do not occur at 1,800 feet. They are not caused by disc-shaped metallic objects hovering in place and then shooting upward at impossible speeds. And they certainly are not witnessed by a dozen trained aviation professionals who all describe the same thing. The explanation was so transparently inadequate that it actually drew more attention to the incident. Aviation forums exploded with discussion. Pilots from around the country weighed in, many pointing out the obvious flaws in the FAA's weather theory. Meteorologists were contacted for comment. Several pointed out that hole punch clouds typically occur in cirrocumulus or altocumulus cloud layers, not the stratus layer reported at O'Hare that day. Others noted that hole punch clouds form gradually over several minutes or longer. They do not appear instantaneously when an object shoots upward through the cloud deck. The credibility of the witnesses became a central issue. Were these people reliable? Were they trained observers? Could they be trusted? The answer, by any objective measure, was yes. These were not random civilians looking up at the sky. These were aviation professionals, pilots with thousands of flight hours, mechanics who had spent careers working on aircraft, air traffic controllers who spent their days identifying and tracking objects in the sky. If anyone could be trusted to accurately describe what they had seen, it was these individuals. But the FAA held to its explanation. Weather phenomena, case closed. No further investigation was warranted. The object that a dozen people had seen hovering silently above one of the busiest airports in the world was officially nothing more than an unusual cloud formation. The witnesses were outraged. Some spoke to the media again, this time more forcefully. They knew what they had seen. It was not a cloud. It was not a weather balloon. It was not a drone. It was something solid and metallic and completely outside their frame of reference. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, gave an interview to a local television station. His frustration was evident. "I know what I saw," he said. "We all know what we saw. And it was not weather. It was a craft, something that flew, something that should not have been there." But by then, the media had moved on. The story had run its 24-hour cycle. There were other headlines, other crises, other distractions. The O'Hare incident faded from the front page, then from the news entirely, and the witnesses were left with their memories and their unanswered questions. Act 3. The cover. Up begins. The official silence surrounding the O'Hare incident might have been the end of the story, except for one thing. Someone filed a Freedom of Information Act request. FOA requests are the bureaucratic equivalent of shining a flashlight into dark corners. They force government agencies to release documents and records that would otherwise remain hidden. In the case of the O'Hare incident, the FOA request demanded all records related to the November 7th sighting, including radar data, tower recordings, and any internal communications about the event. The FAA fought the request. They claimed there were no relevant records. They claimed that no official incident had occurred. They claimed that releasing any information would compromise security protocols. But under FOA law, these objections carried limited weight. Eventually, after months of legal wrangling, the FAA was forced to release a limited set of documents. What those documents revealed was startling. First, there were the tower recordings. Multiple FAA personnel could be heard discussing the incident as it was happening. Controllers mentioned that United Airlines employees were reporting an object over Gate C-17. There was confusion about what it was. There was discussion about whether to alert other aircraft in the area. And there was clear evidence that the incident had been taken seriously in real time, even if the official position later claimed otherwise. One particularly revealing exchange went like this. A controller asked if anyone had visual confirmation. Another voice responded that multiple ground personnel had confirmed seeing something. The third voice asked if it was on radar. The response was negative, no radar contact, which raised an obvious question that no one on the recording seemed willing to address out loud. How can something solid enough to be seen by a dozen people be invisible to radar? The tone of the controllers was professional, but clearly concerned. These were people who dealt with air traffic every day, who were trained to handle emergencies, who understood the systems they were working with, and they were encountering something that did not fit into any of their protocols or procedures. You could hear the uncertainty in their voices, the pauses before responses, the careful choice of words. They knew they were dealing with something unusual, and they were unsure how to proceed. Second, there were internal memos. These documents showed that United Airlines management had taken the incident seriously enough to conduct an internal investigation. They had interviewed witnesses. They had reviewed security footage, though curiously, no footage of the actual object was ever released or acknowledged to exist. And they had communicated with the FAA about the incident, despite the FAA's initial claims that they had no record of it. The existence of these memos contradicted both United Airlines and the FAA's initial denials. If the incident had not happened, why had United conducted an investigation? If the FAA had no record of it, why had United been communicating with them about it? The paper trail, incomplete as it was, made it clear that both organisations had known about the incident from the beginning and had chosen to deny it publicly. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was evidence that NORAD had been briefly involved. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is responsible for monitoring airspace and responding to potential threats. According to the released documents, someone at O'Hare had contacted NORAD about the object. Intercept protocols had been briefly initiated, and then, without explanation, the alert had been cancelled. This detail raised more questions than it answered. Why would NORAD scramble intercept protocols for a weather phenomenon? Why would they cancel those protocols before any aircraft were actually launched? And why was there no follow-up investigation by military authorities? The released documents were heavily redacted. Large sections were blacked out. Entire pages were withheld on grounds of national security or operational security. But even with these limitations, the documents made one thing abundantly clear. The O'Hare incident had been real. It had been witnessed by credible people. It had been taken seriously by multiple agencies, and then it had been deliberately buried. Investigative journalists attempted to follow up. They contacted NORAD directly. NORAD declined to comment, citing classified protocols. They contacted the Air Force. The Air Force said it had no record of any involvement. They contacted Homeland Security. Homeland Security referred them back to the FAA. The paper trail went in circles. Every agency pointed to another agency. Every official response was either a denial or a referral. And slowly, methodically, the bureaucratic machinery ground the incident down to nothing. No threat, no investigation, no explanation required. One former FAA official, speaking off the record years later, admitted what many had suspected all along. "Of course we tracked it," the official said. "Of course we knew it was there." But once it became clear that it was not a conventional aircraft, and once it became clear that it had left without causing any damage or injuries, the decision was made to classify it as a non-event. Why? Because there was no protocol for dealing with it, no framework, no procedure. It was easier to pretend it had not happened than to try to explain what it was. This unofficial admission confirmed what the witnesses had always believed. The incident had been real, the object had been real, and the cover-up had been deliberate. Act 4. The physical impossibility. In the months and years following the O'Hare incident, aviation experts and physicists began to analyse what the witnesses had described. Their conclusion was unanimous. What had been reported was physically impossible according to every known principle of aerodynamics and propulsion. Commercial pilots were interviewed. They pointed out that no known aircraft can hover motionless without visible means of propulsion. Helicopters use rotors, drones use multiple propellers, Harrier jump jets use directed thrust from their engines. All of these methods produce noise, vibration, and visible signs of their operation. The object at O'Hare had none of these characteristics. Moreover, no known aircraft can accelerate from 0 to supersonic speeds instantaneously. Acceleration requires time, it requires thrust. It requires a visible transition from stationary to motion. The object at O'Hare had exhibited none of this. It had been motionless, and then it had been gone. The witnesses described it as if someone had simply switched it from one state to another, with no intermediary phase. The physics of such an acceleration are staggering to contemplate. If an object 30 feet in diameter and presumably massing several tons were to accelerate from 0 to even subsonic speed instantaneously, the forces involved would be catastrophic. The object itself would need to be constructed from materials that could withstand thousands of times the force of gravity. Any conventional materials, steel, aluminum, titanium, would be torn apart by such forces. And yet the witnesses reported no sound of tearing metal, no explosions, no debris falling from the sky. The object had simply gone from stationary to gone in less time than it takes to blink. The hole in the clouds presented its own set of problems. Meteorologists explained that clouds are not solid. They're composed of tiny water droplets or ice crystals suspended in air. When an object passes through a cloud, the cloud does not tear. It does not leave a clean hole with defined edges. It might create temporary wake or disturbance, but that disturbance dissipates almost immediately. The hole described by the O'Hare witnesses had stayed visible for several minutes, with crisp geometric edges that suggested something far more violent than simple passage through water vapour. One aeronautical engineer, speaking anonymously to a science publication, offered a theory. If an object were to accelerate upward with sufficient speed and force, he said, it could potentially create a shock wave that would temporarily displace the cloud layer. But the energy required to do this would be enormous. We are talking about something that would generate sonic booms, visible contrails, tremendous heat. The witnesses reported none of these things. So whatever caused that hole, it was not conventional propulsion. Boeing engineers were contacted for comment. Most declined. A few, speaking off the record, admitted that they had no explanation for what had been described. One engineer put it bluntly. If someone showed me the specs for an aircraft that could do what those witnesses described, I would tell them it was science fiction. You cannot violate the laws of physics, just because you want to. And what they saw violated just about every law we understand. The radar invisibility was another puzzle. Modern radar systems can detect birds. They can detect weather formations. They can detect small drones at significant distances. The idea that a 30-foot metallic disc could hover over a major airport and leave no radar signature made no sense. Unless, some speculated, the object was made of materials or used technology that could somehow absorb or deflect radar waves. But even this explanation raised more questions than it answered. Such technology, if it existed, would represent a breakthrough so significant that it would revolutionize military aviation. Why would it be flying over a civilian airport in broad daylight? Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who first spotted the object, gave one final interview several years after the incident. By then, he had retired from United Airlines. He no longer had anything to lose by speaking publicly. His words were measured and careful, but his conviction was absolute. I have worked on aircraft for 30 years, he said. I know what planes look like. I know what helicopters look like. I know what drones look like. What I saw that day was none of those things. It was something else, something I cannot explain. And I think that is what scares people. Not that we saw something strange, but that we saw something we cannot explain. And if we cannot explain it, then we do not understand the world as well as we thought we did. Another witness, a pilot who had seen the object from his cockpit, was even more direct. If it were a drone, he said, we would be flying them by now. If it were some kind of experimental military craft, someone would have come forward. This was not human technology. I do not know what it was, but I know what it was not, and it was not ours. The physics of the incident remained stubbornly unsolvable. Every attempt to explain it using conventional science fell short. Every theory required assumptions that could not be supported by evidence, and so the incident remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, an anomaly, an impossibility, a hole not just in the clouds, but in our understanding of what was possible. Epilogue. The incident that disappeared. More than 15 years have passed since the O'Hare incident. The witnesses have scattered. Some still work in aviation. Others have retired. A few have passed away. But not one of them has recanted their testimony. Not one has admitted to being mistaken or confused. Not one has changed their story. This consistency is remarkable in itself. Human memory is fallible. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable over time. Details blur, stories change, people misremember. But the O'Hare witnesses have remained consistent for over 15 years. They all describe the same object, the same behaviour, the same departure, the same hole in the clouds. Their accounts have not drifted or evolved. They have not embellished or exaggerated. They have simply reported year after year what they saw that November afternoon. The official record remains unchanged. The FAA still classifies the incident as weather phenomena. No formal investigation was ever conducted. No radar data was ever released. No explanation was ever provided that satisfactorily addressed the facts as reported by the witnesses. Gate C-17 still operates at O'Hare. Planes still taxi past it every day. Passengers still board flights there, completely unaware that they are standing at the site of one of the most credible UFO sightings in modern history. The airport itself has moved on. The airlines have moved on. The world has moved on. But the questions remain. What was the object that hovered over O'Hare on November 7th, 2006? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Who built it? And perhaps most importantly, why has there been such determined resistance to investigating it seriously? Some argue that the resistance stems from simple bureaucratic inertia. Agencies do not like to investigate things they cannot explain. It creates paperwork. It creates liability. It creates uncomfortable questions from the public and the press. Far easier to dismiss the whole thing and move on. But others point to something deeper. The O'Hare incident represents a challenge to our understanding of reality itself. If we acknowledge that the witnesses saw what they claimed to see, then we must also acknowledge that there are technologies operating in our airspace that we do not understand. Technologies that violate our understanding of physics. Technologies that, by definition, are beyond our current scientific framework. For institutions that pride themselves on control and understanding, this is an intolerable conclusion. Others suggest more sinister explanations. They point to the NORAD involvement. They point to the redacted documents. They point to the quick shutdown of any serious investigation. They argue that the government knows more than it is admitting, that the incident was classified, that the truth is being deliberately withheld. The truth, as always, may be more mundane. Perhaps there was no grand conspiracy. Perhaps there was simply an institutional unwillingness to confront something that did not fit into established categories. Perhaps the cover-up, if it can be called that, was not a deliberate act of secrecy, but rather a reflexive defensive action by organisations that were genuinely unsure how to proceed. The witnesses themselves have varying opinions. Some believe the object was extraterrestrial in origin. Others think it was some kind of classified military technology being tested without proper authorization. A few believe it was something else entirely, something that does not fit into any convenient category. But they all agree on one fundamental point. What they saw was real. It was not a hallucination. It was not a hoax. It was not weather. It was a physical object that defied explanation. And the fact that it has been so thoroughly dismissed, so completely erased from official acknowledgement, troubles them deeply. The broader implications of the O'Hare incident extend beyond the specific events of that November afternoon. It raises questions about how our society handles anomalous events, how we respond when trained professionals report something that contradicts our understanding of what is possible, whether we have systems in place to investigate such events seriously and transparently, and whether we are willing to acknowledge uncertainty rather than retreating into comfortable denials. In an age of increasing surveillance, when cameras are everywhere and data is constantly being recorded, the O'Hare incident stands as a reminder that some things still slip through the gaps, that there are still moments when something extraordinary can occur in full view of multiple witnesses and yet leave behind almost no physical evidence. No photographs that clearly show the object, no video footage that has been released publicly, no radar data that confirms what the witnesses saw, just human testimony. Just people willing to put their credibility on the line to say what they experienced. Janet Thornton, the gate supervisor who witnessed the incident, summed it up in an interview years later. "We are trained to be reliable," she said. "We are trained to be precise. Our jobs depend on our ability to observe accurately and report honestly. And then we report something that does not fit the official narrative, and suddenly we are dismissed as unreliable witnesses. That is what hurts the most. Not that people do not believe what we saw, but that they question our credibility and professionalism because we had the courage to report it." The O'Hare incident remains one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in history. It occurred in broad daylight. It was witnessed by multiple trained professionals. It happened at a major public facility with extensive security and monitoring systems. And yet, officially, it does not exist. It is a non-event, a footnote, a curiosity. But for those who were there, who saw the metallic disc hovering silently above Gate C-17, who watched it shoot straight up through the clouds at impossible speed, who stood there looking at the perfect circular hole it left behind, the incident is anything but a curiosity. It is proof that there are things in our skies that we do not understand. Proof that our technology, advanced as it may be, is not the most advanced technology. Proof that we are not alone in believing that the universe holds mysteries we have yet to solve. Thomas Wilkins, now in his 70s, still lives in the Chicago area. He rarely talks about the incident anymore. He has told his story so many times that it has become exhausting. But when pressed, when asked if he still believes what he saw was real, his answer is immediate and unwavering. "I know what I saw," he says. "We all know what we saw, and no amount of official denial will change that. It was there. It was real. It was a craft. That word, craft. It appears again and again in the witness statements. Not object, not phenomenon. Craft. A word that implies intention, design, purpose, control. A word that suggests something built by someone, somewhere, for some reason. And so the O'Hare incident remains, not solved, not explained, not officially acknowledged, but remembered, by the witnesses who will carry it with them for the rest of their lives, by the researchers who continue to study it, by the public who finds in it a glimmer of something extraordinary in an increasingly mundane world. On November 7th, 2006, something impossible happened over Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Something that challenged our understanding of physics, aerodynamics, and technology. Something that was witnessed by credible, trained professionals, and then systematically erased from official acknowledgement. The hole in the clouds has long since closed, but the hole in our understanding remains, and perhaps that is the real legacy of the O'Hare incident. Not what we saw, but what we still do not know, and what we may never know, unless someday someone decides to tell the truth. The end.